So this is part 2 of our 2-part series focusing on ecological succession and what it means to put ecological succession into practice. Our first video went over what is ecological succession, what makes it work, what are some principles behind it. And if you haven't watched that video, go watch it first, and then we will get into this part, which is how do we apply the principles of ecological succession to our land? What does it look like to use these principles in our land? Because in all reality, if we are trying to get the most out of our land and make it the most productive it can be, the healthiest it can be, we need to use the principles that are in accordance with nature. So what are the principles of ecological succession? We need to have living plants and we need to have dying plants. This is the core of using ecological succession, is understanding what plants do for an ecosystem. So living plants provide biomass accumulation. They are holding nutrients, most of that in the form of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. They are providing root exudates to the soil to feed the soil life, these bacteria and fungi. They are storing nutrients, not just your carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. They are storing other nutrients as well, nitrogen being one of those. And last but not least, they are transferring water. They are part of the small water cycle. So they are pulling water out of the soil and transpiring it back into the air. They are also allowing rainfall to filter into the ground via their roots. So what is the value of the dying plants, the dead plant material? It is important for feeding our microbial life, our bacteria and our fungi. It is important as a form of carbon storage, which allows us to keep that soil life alive and also feed the next generation of plants. It provides water retention. Plant material mulched on the ground provides water retention. It keeps our water from just evaporating out of the ground like we sometimes happen in these really low levels, these low stages of succession. If there's too much bare ground, the water can just evaporate out. Another important principle of ecological succession is our bacteria and our fungi, our microbial life, and the ratio between those two. If we want to move up in succession, we need more fungi and a higher ratio of fungi to bacteria. So that's important to keep in mind. What successional stage are we at, and what microbial life fits with that stage? Nutrient storage, as I already mentioned, is important. We need to keep these nutrients cycling, because if you don't use it, you'll lose it. That is a principle that applies to using ecological succession. If your iodine, selenium, copper, whatever you're looking at there, if it is not in a living being, whether it be a plant, a microbe, a animal, if it is not being stored in something, a lot of it will either leach out of the soil or will become locked up and unusable. So it is very important that we keep nutrient storage, which is cycling. You can't just store it without using it. It has to be cycling through the system. So that's another principle. And the last principle that I have on my list is water management. We need to keep moisture in the system. If we lose our moisture, we are not able to proceed to the next step in our ecological succession, or for that matter, maintain a healthy level of succession anywhere in these stages. Wherever we want to be, we can't maintain that unless we have enough water to maintain that. So your berms and swales, your ponds, your plants storing the water, that is a very important principle in using ecological succession. Now there are 3 main categories of agriculture that I would say use ecological succession as their foundation for how they operate. The first one is managed rotational grazing. This is also sometimes called management intensive grazing, holistic planned grazing, total grazing, adaptive grazing. The list goes on. There are so many names for this kind of grazing, but they fundamentally all work the same. And that works off the idea of using your grass and your small plants and running them through an animal. So we let the grass grow up and then we cycle it back down into the soil. We let the grass grow up and we cycle it back. So we use periods of rest and recovery and growth, and then we cycle those with resets, using the animals to reset that. And you can use this with lots of different animals: chickens, rabbits, goats, guinea pigs, sheep, cattle, bison, horses. You can use a lot of animals in this rotational grazing, this managed rotational grazing. So that is one of the styles of farming that uses ecological succession to feed soil fertility. The second is rolled or crimped cover crops. Now, this is typically used in a row crop situation where you're growing corn, soybeans, what have you, squash, pumpkins, and this can be used in a small market garden, or it can be used in a multi-thousand acre row crop farm. We are simply growing a cover crop, which is building biomass, sending down root exudates, holding moisture, holding nutrients, and then we're resetting that with a mechanical tool and rolling and crimping these to kill them, and then using that mat of dead plant material to plant our next stage, which is our crop, into that. So this is the second form of agriculture that uses ecological succession to feed fertility into the system, to hold nutrients, and to just gain that energy in the system and keep things flowing. The third category, and this is one of my favorites, is syntropic agroforestry. And this was started in modern times by Ernst Gotsch in Brazil. He was a Swiss fellow that moved to Brazil and took an old coffee plantation that was abandoned because the soil fertility was so bad. He started planting plants in here and in this farm and totally changed the ecology of that farm. And he was literally using ecological succession to do this. And he was so successful that the government found him, as I understand, this is just an anecdote that I picked up somewhere, that the government actually discovered his project because they were looking at cloud formation and there was clouds forming over his farm, and that should not have been happening there because that area was desertifying. And so this is very, very, very powerful stuff where we can actually change the ecology of an area using these principles. So syntropic farming, what it does is it uses any plant, whether it's annual, perennial, whatever. We plant down here and then we chop and drop plants back into the system. They might produce a crop, but we feed that energy, feed that dead plant material. We allow the roots to die back and feed the soil, and we just keep moving up in succession until we reach a peak, and then we can choose to reset to any stage in succession that we want to. So these syntropic principles are gaining that energy, pushing that energy, spiraling that energy upwards and forwards as we gain momentum, and using plant material, living and dying, to feed that. And this is a form of agroforestry. So we may have tree species, shrub species, ground layers. It's a food forest on steroids because we're using every tool possible to keep this moving forward and gaining as much energy and as much life as possible. So there are some tools that we can use in all of these types of farming that we're going to go over what these different tools are and how they apply to using ecological succession for our farms. And just to be clear, while there's these three main categories of farming that use ecological succession, you can mix and match them to an extent. You can use cattle possibly to run over one of your cover crops and use that instead of using a roller crimper before you go into the next crop stage or whatever your next stage is in your cropping system. You can use those animals in there to provide reset rather than a mechanical crimper. You can have rows of trees in your crop farm that you pollard. You cut them back and allow the roots to die back and feed the soil, or for that matter, use a ripper along the edges of the tree rows to cut off and prune those roots, and those roots dying back and the air getting down in there provides more life to the soil. So these things aren't separate categories. We want to use them in a way that makes sense for our land and our goals as a farm. So the tools, we need to get to the tools here. What are the tools of using ecological succession in our farms? The first tool is biomass management. We need to manage the biomass. We need to have as much biomass as we can, practically speaking, and we need to manage it. We need to let it live and then cut it back and let it die. And how do we do this? One of the best ways is animals trampling the plants back in. Another way, which speeds up the process a little bit, is having the animal digest those plants. Animal eats the plant, it breaks it down, poops it out the backside, and it's ready to be uptaken into the next stage immediately or almost immediately. Another way of biomass management is rolling or crimping, with using a mechanical tool to push down some of these lower stages, your grass, your cover crops or whatever, crimping them back into the ground and feeding that next stage. Mowing is also a tool that you can use, and sometimes mowing makes more sense than a roller crimper or something else, although mowing is probably one of your less effective tools depending on what you're doing. As we move up into these higher stages, if we're trying to provide biomass management, we will need to use things like chainsaws, axes, pruners with your woody crops. So pruning, chop and drop, and so basically any way of letting the plants grow and then cutting them and cycling them back into the system. That is the first tool of using succession and applying that to our farms. The second tool, which includes factors from the first tool but has a little bit more going on, is grazing or animals in the system. Animals can provide impact to the soil itself. Their hooves, their clawing, a chicken claws in the ground and it digs little pockets in the ground, and that provides water catchment, that maybe pushes some plant matter down in contact with the soil where the soil microbes can start eating on that a little bit better. Whereas if you have dead plant material that's sitting up in the air, it's not going to get very good decomposition. Whereas if you have animals pushing that down into the ground, you're going to get better decomposition. Biomass management, whether that be in eating the plants and cycling them back in, or trampling them, or what have you, they are going to provide biomass management. So animals are an amazing tool. Nutrient storage. You can store nutrients from your system in your animals, and there's some nutrients that's the best place to store them, because animals hold different nutrients and collect them and focus them, and that's very, very valuable for a system, is having animals in the system. You cannot have a healthy system without animals. It's not possible. You have to have animals in the system. And so if you want to have a farm without animals, you're going to at least have to track some wild ones. A faster way to get there is just to bring animals onto the property. Also, last but not least, soil inoculation. So a animal can feed the soil with its manure when they shed hair, when they urinate, their saliva, their bodily fluids of any sort are inoculating the soil with good microbes and healthy microbes. So that's very important. Animals are a very important tool in ecological succession. Another important part, an important tool, is your amendments and nutrients. Now, I want to differentiate between amendments and nutrients and fertilizers. Those are two separate categories. They're very closely related. There's a lot of overlap, but they are not the same thing. An amendment is dealing with nutrients. A fertilizer, that term is misused a lot. A fertilizer is dealing with fertility, with life, your microbial life. So first category, first tool in these sisters, these twin sisters, is the amendments and nutrients. A very important tool. So what does this look like? In the early stages, when we're dealing with a poor system, a system that is not functioning very well, it can be very important to bring in rock and clay dust or ashes. These fine particles are holding nutrients that our soil might be missing or need, and there's ways you can calculate what you need and how to apply that. Another important part of your nutrients in your system, and that using that as a tool, managing your nutrients, is again plant and animal storage. You can put nutrients into the system, but if you don't have a way to cycle them, you're not going to be able to keep them. So if you're focusing on nutrients as a tool, you need to focus on your plants and animals. Another way to use the tool of nutrients and minerals and amending your soil is attracting wild animals and birds. So we just talked about having our own plants and animals storing these things, but migratory animals and birds can bring nutrients from a longer ways away from our farm and bring them to our farm. So attracting migratory waterfowl, migratory birds that travel long distances, and they can bring nutrients back to our farm and keep our system functioning better. Just trace minerals. They can bring those back to our farms from long distances away. Migratory fish. A lot of our rivers used to have migratory fish in them, the salmon, the sturgeon, that are bringing these nutrients back up. We can harvest these fish and then put them back in the land, and the bears and otters and various things would have participated in this as well. So planting plants that attract these things, or providing habitat for wild animals and birds and even insects. There's migratory insects. The monarch butterfly travels long distance. So there are birds, animals, and insects that we can attract to our farms and use that as a subset of our nutrient tool and focusing on our nutrients. Second part of that stage, the twin sisters, if you will, fertilizers and inoculants. And like I said before, fertility is life. It is not your nutrients. NPK is not a fertility program. It is an amendment. It is not a fertilizer. So what do I mean by a fertilizer? Something that's going to have bacteria in it. One thing we already mentioned is animals. We keep coming back to animals. Very important. Animal, saliva, manure, urine, hair. Those are a fertility inoculant for your soil. Continuously inoculating your soil with those microbes can be very, very valuable, a very valuable subset of our fertility tool, especially if you're on poor, degraded land. Bringing on animals and using them as nutrient storage, and you can bring feed on to keep them alive, but then they're inoculating the soil with their waste and such like, and keeping the life in that system. Another valuable subset of the fertility tool is compost. Compost has a lot of life in it. We're decomposing plant material, which is very important for ecological succession, and we are increasing our fungi and bacteria populations in that compost, and then we are spreading those populations on the ground that we're managing. and this can be done via compost extract and compost tea or the compost itself. But compost is a very, very valuable part of our fertility tool. And biofertilizers, fertilizers that focus on certain microbes. We're combining oftentimes amendments and fertility in some of these. We might put a little bit of rock dust in some of these biofertilizers or a little bit of ashes, those sorts of things. So like I said, amendments and fertility are very closely related. There's a lot of blurry lines between those two, but there is a differentiation. Another good example is indigenous microorganisms from natural farming, or Jadam microbial solution from the Jadam system, lactic acid bacteria serum from natural farming. These things are also great ways to use the fertility tool in your system. And last but not least, mulch and chop and drop provides food for your soil microbes and provides water retention that allows them to continue to live and function. And that brings us to our last tool in managing ecological succession, and that is water management. You cannot have life without water. So water management on your property, that tool is critical to being able to manage ecological succession well. Like we already mentioned, your mulch, your chop and drop is very critical to keeping the water in the ground and not just evaporating into the air, and also increasing the carbon levels in your soil is very, very critical for this. So your roots, as your plants grow and then die, you're chop and dropping them, you're grazing them, whatever you're doing, you're roller crimping them, those roots die back. That root dieback feeds the soil life, increases your soil carbon, and now you can hold more water in your soil. The number I've heard is up to 20,000 gallons per acre per percentage point of soil carbon increased. So for each percentage point, if you go from 1% soil carbon, 2% soil carbon, you can now hold 20,000 gallons more water per acre. You do 1% to 3%, that's a 2-point delta between the two. You can now hold 40,000 gallons, and so on and so forth. We recently had a flood in our area, and I think about 6 inches of rain is what we got, 6 inches of rain. And I calculated that if we had had a increase of 8.15 points in percentage points of carbon, if we had, let's say we're on average around 2% soil carbon around here, if we were 10.15% soil carbon, we could have absorbed, I believe, all of that water and not had the flooding that we had. So that is a very, very valuable part. Your water management is a very valuable tool in your ecological succession, applying that, and your soil carbon is foundational to that. Another way to manage water is keyline plowing or broad forking, which is the same principle, just on a different scale. So your keyline plowing is a ripper plow that goes through and cuts a groove in the soil, and you do this on contour, so that when the water runs down the watershed, it hits that groove in the ground and runs into the ground. And you get better water retention, you get that water down in the ground where you want it, and it doesn't just run off and take everything with it. Broad forking does the same thing, does some other things as well, but you can use broad forking if you're working on a smaller scale to do basically the same things. Create cracks in the ground to get water down in there. Swales. Swale and berm is another great way to manage water on your landscape. You're just catching water on contour typically and holding that until you need it later. Last but not least, ponds. Ponds can be very important. You can incorporate them in your berm and swale situation, your berm and swale plan. You can incorporate ponds into that, mini ponds, big ponds. I think small ponds are actually more effective. Having more small ponds is more effective than having one big pond, but ponds can be a very important part of managing water on your land, and that is very important for getting the life into your system. So just a little bit of review here. The principles: got to have living and dying plants. Got to have the microbes, where we want them. We need to have the right ratios, the right populations, and we balance that. We work that with changing our plant stages and where we're at. We've got to have nutrient storage. Very important to have animals in the system. Very important to have a broad diversity of plants in the system that store different nutrients. Some plants will hold more of one nutrient than another, and so we need to have a broad diversity of plants and animals in our system in order to make sure we're holding on to as many nutrients as possible. And last but not least, water management on our farms. We must keep our water where we want it. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any thoughts, please leave a comment, a question. I would love to engage with you on this. This is something I'm very passionate about, and I want to see these principles used and applied, and we can't use them and apply them unless we understand them. So I'm trying to understand these myself and then teach that to other people and to you. Thank you.